Basically, actually, if you read the description of our talk, it doesn't really reflect what we're going to do today, because we wrote that description months ago, and the talk kind of evolved to something else because we started kind of thinking about JavaScript frameworks and listing them and kind of thinking about, okay, what are the characteristics, the philosophies, and it just seems like it's not very interesting to just list them and kind of say, okay, here they are, whatever. So rather than doing that, we're going to try to offer you a little bit of a guide that could help you to choose a framework that would be the right framework for you if you have to make that decision or evaluate that, right? So, we are Henning Glatter-Götz and Kahlil Prefect. We're Glatter-Götz and Kahlil Tweets on Twitter. We're developers from Alpha Centauri, obviously, and the authors of the incredibly successful book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to JavaScript Frameworks. Also, we're doing the Descriptive podcast, where we interview developers about their programmer origin stories, and we also co-host the Reactive podcast together with Raquel Velez, who works at NPM. She sent us those beautiful t-shirts. Wonderful. And we talk about technology news and stuff that we work on and care about and stuff like that. So, back to our incredibly successful book. It's the second most, just a few facts, so that you know that we're a big deal. It's the second most successful book to come out of the great publishing houses of Ursa Minor. It was never published on Earth. Obviously, that's the reason we're here. And it's slightly less popular than The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, more popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, and better selling than 50 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, more controversial than Ulan Kulufi's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters, Where God Went Wrong, Some More of God's Greatest Mistakes, and who's this God person anyway? So Earth Publishers, we're here all day and stuff, right? So talk to us. Right, so the ideas of our book. We're going to talk about the ideas in our book. And the idea is that there is an ever-expanding galaxy of JavaScript frameworks, and that is kind of scary, right? And because there's all these frameworks and libraries popping up all over the place, there's people who have to choose one of those frameworks to bet on. If you have a team or a company or a consultancy and you really want to get into one of those things and solve your problems with that tool, there's this eternal question popping up, which one, right? And the answer, of course, is 42. Thank you. Good night. Just kidding. The answer is also not a checklist, so we don't have a checklist. Very sorry. You can't walk out of here and check off some stuff and know which framework you're going to use. Instead, there is some sort of a path, a guideline that we're going to try to show you. And surprisingly, the deciding factors that we want to emphasize are actually non-technical. It's more about what are your feels.
All right, so let's get into the problems that you might be faced with when you want to make this choice. There is a staggering number of JavaScript frameworks, and basically, if you take a look at those, you will be very quickly able to boil them down or distill them down to only a handful, although there are that many. There is always an enormous amount of noise around anything new in JavaScript, but just get off the hype train. We assure you, you will not miss anything. Anything important will bubble up to the surface and will come to your attention sooner or later. You might be afraid of making the wrong choice, and maybe you will make the wrong choice. There is no guarantee that you will make the right choice ever. So just let go of that fear. There's no point being afraid of that anyway. And if your team is lacking in some areas, you're simply going to have to level up in those areas. And if you have a lack of time, well, you simply have to make time. There's no choice. And there's this common misconception that a framework or the framework is supposed to solve all of your problems. That is completely unrealistic. And there is no such thing. So there will always be edge cases, and that is perfectly fine.
So what Henning is trying to say is don't panic. right? Everything is fine. But here's what you're going to do, right? So if you have to make a decision about JavaScript frameworks, you will have to look at mature frameworks. Only mature frameworks will be some sort of an option for you. And you have to make that list. So what are mature frameworks? Mature frameworks are the ones that are, around for like a year or so and have a stable, are at a stable 1.0 to whatever version, and are backed by a team that you feel that you can trust, right? And they might also have some sort of a significant market share, which you kind of have to decide for yourself what that is. Once you have that list, and actually that list is not going to be super long, right? So, there's no panic to be had here. And then when you have that list, you might want to narrow that one down and kind of map that against your technical requirements. So if you have very clear technical requirements where okay, you look at documentation or the implementation of a framework, you see this one will not work, this one will work better, you will eventually end up with a shorter list. Maybe, maybe not. And this is the part where nobody can really do any work for you. Like you have to have a technical person take the frameworks and look at your technical requirements, and you have to map, those against each other. And this is just work that needs to be done, and you just need to have somebody you trust, or yourself, you trust yourself enough to do that, right? But there's a kind of a funny thing happening. So you will most likely end up with Ember, Angular, and React on that list. It's very, very likely. And maybe there's also Vue.js on that list. Maybe there is, if you're like super interested in up-and-coming frameworks, maybe there's Elm on that list, which is not a JavaScript framework, but compiles to JavaScript. And maybe there is Cycle.js on that list. And the funny thing is that all these frameworks, they are kind of converging to the same point. It's actually interesting, or actually it's, when you think about that, it's funny that they don't use any of the same code, because they do very similar things. Because what happened in, I think 2014 it was, that React kind of popped up, and all over 2015, within the JavaScript community, the kind of influence of React and the ideas that the React team brought to the JavaScript community were felt very thoroughly throughout the whole community, and there's a lot of stuff popping up. And it turns out that kind of all the big players, they kind of have agreed on building blocks that were introduced by the React team. Those building blocks are a component tree. So we had components before, but to strictly organize your application as a component tree is something that's kind of new for the front end. And then you have the virtual DOM, of course, and you have unidirectional data flow. So the virtual DOM has landed in Ember.js. It's coming with Angular 2 as well. Vue.js has something similar. Cycle.js is using a virtual DOM. Elm is also using a virtual DOM. So all this stuff, all these ideas, they stem out of the paradigm of functional programming, where the Facebook team kind of said, we want to think about the UI as the result of a pure function that you feed some state, right? So a pure function is a function that doesn't create any side effects, and when you feed it the same state, it will always produce the same result. In this case, same kind of UI, right? So this is the idea. And the virtual DOM helps the developers to actually think in this way, right? Because you just feed the virtual DOM some state, and it does the updating part of the DOM. Like that is like the big bottleneck of JavaScript frameworks, the performance bottleneck. The virtual DOM, the library just takes care of that by itself, right? So you just feed it, you figure out your state with a unidirectional data flow. That was the Flux thing that they basically proposed. And last year, Flux, all kinds of other variations of Flux happened, like Redux and model view intent, which is used by Cycle, and Reflux and all those names, but they all do the same thing. They take some action, they mutate the state, and then the state gets fed to the mutated state gets fed to the virtual DOM, and it just takes care of updating the DOM. So all those frameworks that are relevant to you, most likely, have those building blocks. right? So basically, in our opinion, if you did all that kind of technical checking, and you really have no time to do some more research, you can really pick any and you'll be fine, as long as you commit 100% to that framework, into the way of doing those, the framework way or whatever. But we would definitely recommend to take some time to do some more research, because there are some other deciding factors that we feel are very important, which are philosophy, culture, and community of that framework, right? So the PCC, whatever. The philosophy of a framework would be something that is, like the broader goals. What does it say on the box? Meaning, if you go to the website of that framework, when you read the docs, you read the guides, what are the ideas that kind of are, that the framework is based on, basically. And the culture would be something like the values and behavior that is propagated by the core team throughout the project, through, to the community and to the users of the framework. Community would be something like data, right? So who are the people that use it? How big is the community? Where are they? And where do they meet? And what do they care about? So we think that's super important to learn about those things, because once you start doing that, you will start to feel drawn to one of those communities or surrounding ecosystems of this framework. And so we have a few ideas what you could do to find out about that. And we kind of emphasizing this because in conversations with people who are in the situation that have to kind of choose a framework, we kind of feel like this is something that is being ignored a little bit, because it's not, it's not technical, it's not measurable necessarily, but it's just as important in our opinion. So, of course, we're talking about an open source framework, so they're all on GitHub, so you should go to GitHub and read some issues if you want to find out about, what kind of the fabric of this community is, because you see core developers, core contributors, and community members talking to each other and solving problems. And there's even, non-technical problems being solved. So if you're a non-technical person, you're interested in these, the ecosystem of a framework, you can definitely read a lot out of that. And then also, this is something that doesn't feel like work, but it should be part of the evaluation. You should go to Twitter, and you should read, the tweets of those authors and see what do they think about, what do they feel, because the JavaScript community on Twitter is very vibrant. There's a lot going on. People are sharing a lot, they're very open about what they think, and there's a lot that you can learn from that, right? So how do they conduct themselves in public in relationship to the people who use it? And this is really the thing, like, a framework is really people. It's for people and it's from people, and that's why this is such a huge deciding factor. And we'll talk about that a little later, how this is also impactful after you chose. So, of course, watch conference talks. I mean, you're at a conference, so you're going to be aware of this, but most frameworks have some sort of a dedicated conference to them. All the talks on YouTube. You can see the core developers talking about, the state of the framework, where it's going, and you can learn a lot about the philosophy behind that. And you can also see contributors talking about the framework, community members talking about, what they care about in relationship to the framework. So the question is always, when you do that, how, does that fit to your culture in your company? How you think about software, how you think about building apps, and how you want to build apps in the future, basically. How do you feel? Do you feel drawn to that, basically? And then there's, of course, the user groups. You speak to the people. Go to meetup.com, find people that are using the frameworks close to you, and just find out about how they feel about using it, what are the problems, what is great about it. And this is also, of course, hiring opportunity, blah, blah, blah. You can also host those meetups and really, again, meet the people, basically. Same goes for the chats. There's always some sort of a chat, like a Slack, IRC, or Gitter chat for each of those frameworks. And you should totally jump in there and figure out, what are they talking about? Why? How? How are they interacting? All this kind of communication stuff is super important, because you will have to really learn this framework really well, and you have to be part of this community in order to work effectively with it. And of course, podcasts are a great way to learn about, in a very compressed manner, to learn about those frameworks, because the authors were always, like all the authors, have been guests on some sort of a podcast, like an open source podcast or a JavaScript podcast, like JS Jabber or the Changelog. And there you can find out you can get a quick overview over, okay, this is how they're thinking, this is, the type of problems they're trying to solve, and this really fits my problem or does not fit my problem, right? So this kind of context is incredibly important. And then also, what gives you more context are also track records of the authors of the framework, which you don't find all the time, but sometimes they have some sort of a history in open source, and you can kind of look that up and see, get a sense of the kind of quality that you would find in their current work. Right. So I would say, if you need to choose a framework, you're going to do the technical stuff, evaluate that, and then you should really dive into the different communities and use that to choose and ask yourself, how does that feel for me? And how does that work with the culture of my company or my team? And do we get excited about this? Do we want to go to those meetups? Do we even want to contribute maybe, right? Do you have local access to the community? If that's important to you, that might be a factor to choose a certain framework. And then, like I said, do you want to participate? Do you want to contribute? Those things are really important. So, might be a little bit straightforward, but this is something that we see as, overlooked a little bit. And those things also, these kind of surrounding factors have great impact on the time after you chose. And this is what Henning's going to talk about a little bit.
All right, so you made your choice, you found your perfect framework, congratulations. But this is actually not the end of it. You need to do a few more things in order to assure success. So, first of all, you need to submit to the framework. Then you need to give all your earthly possessions to us. Oh, just kidding. And what you really need to do is you need to get a commitment from your team, make a commitment to yourself, get a commitment from management that you are going to spend the time that it takes to get really good at this. And by that I mean basically there's a learning curve associated with each framework that you have to get over. Some are steeper, some are not so steep. But just plan for that and realize that in the beginning, obviously, things are going to be somewhat slower. Follow the established best practices of the framework. That'll help you learn much faster. When you need to get help in the community, that'll be much easier because then, of course, you're all speaking the same language or a common language, and you can get help much better. And in the more opinionated frameworks, you have no choice anyway. If you're going to go against the framework way in something like Ember, you're going to endure a lot of pain. And that's actually by design, because the developers or the authors, they want to keep you on the happy path. So we think you should basically try to let go of the current way of doing things, how you are comfortable with doing things, and try to learn how to write idiomatic framework code. There's some good advice that I've heard when people ask, should I learn this new tech, that new tech, or should I stick to the fundamentals? If you feel like you don't know the fundamentals well enough yet or at all, then you should definitely learn the fundamentals, because they either don't change at all or change very slowly. Libraries and frameworks, they come and go. And if you know the fundamental software engineering principles, then that will help you learn any framework much faster. It will help you to learn how to use the framework properly much faster. And also, if you need to switch at some point, which will probably happen, you will be much faster doing that. And when we say old, let me give you an example of that. So everybody's talking about functional programming now, right? It's everywhere. And the theory on which functional languages are built upon actually dates back to the 1930s. And the first functional or functional-ish languages came onto the scene in 1950. So I don't think there's anyone here that goes that far back. But this is quite surprising in most cases that these things are very old. And along the same lines of fundamentals, JavaScript is kind of a fundamental thing here because this is what the frameworks are written in. So it would be a good idea to get really, really good at JavaScript. It will make you more productive. That goes without saying. And the copy and paste days, or the copy and paste jQuery days, are sort of over, we think. And if you know jQuery, if you know JavaScript really well, then again, you will be much faster at understanding the underlying framework code, and you will be much faster at solving these edge cases that we have discussed earlier. So I think you see sort of a common thread through this here. It's all about education and training and learning. So we already heard that you can learn a lot by going to meetups, and I would say if you want to get involved in the community, the next step to do that is to force yourself to give a talk at one of these meetups, for example, because you will be surprised at how much you learn if you force yourself to stand up in front of a group of people and try to explain something to them. And similarly, if you as a business host or sponsor one of these meetups or a conference, then you signal to the community that you care about the community. And you also signal to your own developers and to all other developers that you care about the education of their developers. So, and then further, of course, as Kahlil already said a little bit, is that you then have access to a talent pool when you want to start to hire people. And I think the same thing goes for conferences. It's just sort of the next level up. While meetups are kind of geographically localized, conferences are wider reaching. So the bottom line is basically train your developers. And we heard a little bit about why, and now we're going to hear a bit about how. There's enormous amount of training resources out there, both online and in person. You can have people come to your company. In every community, there's sort of a few people that stand out as good educators. You can have them come on site, send your developers there. Something a little more reasonable is just invest in books, and if you think, well, books, they go out of date, especially in JavaScript, they're out of date by, the time they come out. Again, stick to the fundamentals. The books that deal with the fundamentals, that will be relevant for a much longer time. And we think you should create a good onboarding process for your developers. So something that can be repeated when you bring new people on is just so they can come up to speed quickly. And you could do something like that by having internal training, sort of an internal boot camp, I guess, if your organization is big enough, or do some sort of mentorship program where you assign a senior person to the new person for a certain amount of time. All right, so we want to round this out or finish this out by giving you a little bit of a personal experience on how we arrived at the frameworks that we work with. I consider myself a back-end developer. That's what I've done for most of my career. But about two or 3 years ago, I started to look around for a JavaScript front-end framework because I wanted to build simple UIs for my back-end systems to monitor certain aspects of it. And I wanted to be able to do that easily and quickly. And so I started out with the usual suspects, Backbone, Knockout. Then Angular came along, and I'm like, Google, that looks really good and promising. But I didn't have time to get into that too much. And then by chance, I heard an interview with Yehuda Katz and Tom Dale, who are the authors of, or the original authors of Ember.js. And they were talking about the things that were important to them, things like developer happiness and the ideas they had for the roadmap ahead, how a sane upgrade process was important to them, and how they wanted to implement this release train so that the upgrading is easier for them. So these are things that make your life as a developer easier. And for some reason, that just totally spoke to me. Without looking at any tech, I simply decided on Ember based on that. And I'm actually really happy with that decision to this day, because I think what they're doing is really awesome. So that sort of highlights why we think there's a lot of touchy-feely stuff that's involved as well, not just technical.
Right. And so my story basically is that I started working at 1&1 in Karlsruhe last year in around April. And I was not, I was kind of surprised by what they're doing, and that they actually want to work with some really modern kind of front-end stack. And I joined at a time where they had already chosen their front-end stack, basically. Did a long evaluation, and what fell out on the other end was Angular. And I came in not so interested in Angular anymore at that point. I was also very attracted to Ember, actually, for the same reasons. And so I came in there, and I came in as a front-end architect, so I had a little bit of, like if I really want to push a re-evaluation, I could have done it, but it didn't make any sense because it would have just pushed out like the implementation of the applications, it would just have pushed it back and back and back. So we sat down as a team, basically decided, okay, this is fine. We're gonna take this. This kind of harkens back to what I said before. Like if you have no other option, but you have like your kind of list of frameworks. Okay, they will work. Then you can really pick any, and it will be fine. And this is basically what we did. We said, okay, we're just going to pick this one, and we're gonna go full 100. We're gonna commit to it. We're going to be migration ready, right? So we spent a lot of time, looking into how to make, how to build an Angular 1 app so that you don't have to do a lot of work if you have to migrate, or when you migrate to Angular 2. We already knew Angular 2 is coming, and all those kind of functional paradigms are also, are in Angular 2 upcoming now. So. So that was also very exciting, like technology-wise, what's happening. So this is, again, one of those, it's just trying to emphasize that point, that if you go all the way and you really learn the thing, you'll be fine. And we are like super fast, so we have a lot of time for questions, actually. So.
No question.
Yeah?
Technology speaking, drawn to a framework that really suits my needs, and I made everything said like dive into the issues, see how they're working, see what's underneath them. But then it just happened that the whole community just completely threw me off. Like I couldn't stand how everybody was working with those tools I thought would be fitting. So is there like some sort of middle ground, like say, okay, if it's really fitting for you on that terms, just leave the community as it is, or is it the community more important for choosing it than being technically drawn to the one framework? Like, what if those two pillars, you just can send one, not on the other?
I think that depends on you. I mean, for me, I just could speak for myself, it would definitely not work. I mean, that is something I have to lean on very heavily all the time, and it makes it more fun. I mean, if the people are nice and it's energizing. If the community is not friendly or nice, then it sucks.
Yeah, it's definitely problematic, because if you also, if your team has to grow and you have to get people in, then you might not like those people, So or whatever, like the way they work or the tools that they're used to, because you are using a whole different tool stack or whatever, and now you have to kind of convince them to use your tools and stuff like that. So it's definitely, it just creates a lot of work, And if you, and the other way around, if you gel really well with the community of the framework you're using, then this can take, this does a lot for you. They are building, tooling that you might just use, or add-on solutions and stuff like that. So there's just all this kind of momentum going on. And if you are like the one fighting against it, then you're not doing yourself a favor. That's for sure. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.